Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate you choosing to spend your time with this video, whether you're here to unwind, to learn something new, or simply to enjoy a moment of calm. If you find these peaceful history documentaries relaxing or helpful, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It supports the channel more than you know and helps these tranquil journeys reach others who may need them as well. Now, take a deep breath, settle in, and enjoy the story. Chapter 1: The Dawn of the Viking Age. Close your eyes now and let yourself drift back through time, back more than 1200 years, to a world that exists now only in fragments of memory, in archaeological artifacts pulled from ancient graves, in words scratched onto parchment by trembling hands. It's early June, in the year 793, and you're standing on the coast of northern England, on a small island called Lindisfarne, known to the Vikings who will soon arrive. Lindisfarne. The North Sea stretches before you, grey and endless, its waters churning with that restless energy that characterizes these northern latitudes. The sea here is never truly calm, never peaceful in the way that Mediterranean waters can be. Even on relatively quiet days, there's always movement, always the sense that beneath the surface, powerful forces are at work. Currents pulling and pushing, tides rising and falling with the ancient rhythm of the moon. The air carries the sharp, clean taste of salt. If you breathe deeply, you can feel it in your lungs, that bracing quality that makes you feel more alive, more present in your body. The wind never quite stops here, always moving across the water, bringing with it the smell of seaweed and fish, of distance and possibility. Seabirds wheel overhead, their cries echoing across the water, and on the beaches, waves crash endlessly against the stones, a sound that has continued unchanged since long before humans first arrived on these shores, and will continue long after the last human voice has fallen silent. On this particular morning, the sea seems more restless than usual. The waves are higher, choppier, driven by winds that have been building for days. The sky is overcast, layers of grey clouds moving across the heavens like armies on the march. It's the kind of weather that makes fishermen stay close to shore, that makes travelers postpone their journeys, that creates an atmosphere of vague unease, even though nothing specific has happened to warrant concern. From across the water, almost invisible at first against the grey horizon, a few ships appear. They're still distant, but as they draw closer, you can begin to make out their distinctive shapes. These are not the rounded, heavy cargo vessels that occasionally visit these shores, bringing goods from other parts of England or from the continent. These ships are longer, sleeker, built for speed and maneuverability. Their prows rise high out of the water, carved into the shapes of dragon heads, fierce and fantastical, designed to ward off evil spirits when at sea, and to inspire terror when approaching enemy shores. The dragon-headed prows are one of the most iconic images of the Viking Age, instantly recognizable even today, more than a millennium after the last Viking longship was built. But on this morning in 793, they're new to English eyes, unfamiliar, and therefore all the more frightening. The people of Lindisfarne, those who notice the approaching ships, might initially think they're traders, or perhaps messengers from some distant kingdom. But as the vessels come closer, moving with a purposeful directness that suggests hostile intent, that initial assumption begins to give way to growing alarm. The ships are making directly for the island, for Lindisfarne, for the monastery of St. Cuthbert that stands as a beacon of faith and learning in this remote corner of England. The monastery is home to monks who have devoted their lives to prayer, to the study of scripture, to the copying of sacred texts in the scriptorium, where they spend long hours hunched over parchment, their hands cramping from the detailed work of illuminating manuscripts, with intricate designs and brilliant colors made from crushed minerals and plant extracts. This is a holy place, a sanctuary where the concerns of the violent, chaotic world beyond its walls are supposed to be kept at bay. The monks here live lives of deliberate simplicity and devotion, following the rule of Saint Benedict, dividing their days between prayer, work, and study. They rise before dawn for the first prayers of the day, their voices joining together in the dim light of the chapel, chanting psalms that have been chanted by monks in countless monasteries across Christendom. They eat simple meals, often in silence, listening to readings from scripture or the lives of saints. They tend their gardens, copy their manuscripts, care for travelers and pilgrims who occasionally visit this remote island. The monastery has accumulated treasures over the generations, beautifully illuminated gospels, reliquaries containing the bones of saints, chalices, and crosses made of precious metals, gifts from pious nobles who sought the monks' prayers and the blessing of Saint Cuthbert, the hermit saint, whose shrine makes Lindisfarne a destination for pilgrims. These treasures represent not just material wealth but centuries of devotion, the accumulated spiritual capital of generations of believers. And the monastery is undefended. Why would it need defenses? It's a house of God, dedicated to peace and prayer. The very idea of attacking such a place would be unthinkable to Christian warriors, who, whatever their other sins, draw the line at desecrating holy ground and murdering men of God. The monastery has no walls designed to withstand assault, no garrison of soldiers, no weapons beyond perhaps a few knives for cutting food and tools for various tasks. The monks' safety has always depended not on physical defenses, but on the sanctity of their calling, on the assumption that no one would dare to violate such holy ground. But the men in those approaching ships are not Christians. They follow the old gods of the north, Odin, Thor, Freya, and the rest of the Norse pantheon. To them, the monastery is not a sacred space to be respected, but simply a target, a concentration of wealth guarded by men who have forsworn violence and therefore cannot effectively defend themselves. It's an opportunity almost too perfect to pass up. The ships beach themselves on the shore, their shallow drafts allowing them to be driven right up onto the sand and rocks. Men pour out of them, dozens of warriors who have been cramped in the ships for days, eager to stretch their legs, and more importantly, eager for the plunder they've been promised. They're armed with swords, axes, and spears. Many carry round wooden shields painted with various designs. Some wear leather armor, or even the occasional coat of mail, expensive and prized, passed down through generations. Their hair and beards are long, often braided, and their appearance would have seemed outlandish, barbaric to English eyes accustomed to different styles of dress and grooming. They move with purpose and coordination, not a disorganized mob, but a disciplined force that has planned this raid carefully. Some head directly for the monastery buildings, while others spread out to secure the area, to make sure no one escapes, to raise the alarm in nearby settlements, to begin rounding up anyone they find who might be sold as a slave. The doors to the monastery of St. Cuthbert are kicked in with a violence that shatters the morning calm. The sound of splintering wood echoes across the island, a harsh intrusion into the peaceful routine of monastic life. The monks, who moments before were engaged in their morning prayers, or perhaps breaking their fast with simple bread and weak beer, suddenly find themselves confronting armed warriors who have burst into their sanctuary. The air, which moments before was filled with the quiet murmur of prayer, with the gentle scratch of quills on parchment, with the everyday sounds of a religious community going about its daily life, now rings with screams and the terrible clash of steel against bone. The monks, defenseless and bewildered, are set upon by men who show no mercy, no respect for their holy calling, no hesitation in raising weapons against men who have never raised weapons against anyone. Precious artifacts, accumulated over generations of devotion and craftsmanship, are plundered without any appreciation for their spiritual or artistic value. To the raiders, these are simply objects made of gold, silver, and precious gems, portable wealth that can be easily carried away and later melted down or sold. The illuminated manuscripts, which represent thousands of hours of painstaking labor by skilled scribes and artists, are treated as worthless unless their covers are decorated with precious metals or jewels. Pages that took months to create are scattered, torn, discarded as rubbish. Monks are slaughtered where they stand, their prayers cut short, their peaceful existence ended in moments of brutal efficiency. Some are killed immediately, cut down by sword or axe as they try to flee, or as they kneel in prayer, commending their souls to God. Others are taken captive, to be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets, or in Dublin, or in other centres of the Viking slave trade. The elderly and infirm, those judged to have no value as slaves, are often killed out of hand. The younger, healthier monks are herded together, to be marched to the ships and carried away to a future of servitude in lands whose very names they've never heard. The holy place itself is set ablaze. Flames consume centuries of faith and learning, turning wooden buildings to ash, destroying manuscripts and relics, leaving behind only scorched stone and bitter memories. The smoke rises high into the grey sky, visible for miles, a signal to other communities along the coast that something terrible has happened, that a new kind of threat has arrived on these shores. Now, this isn't the first time Vikings have raided England or Ireland. These northern warriors have been probing the coast for years, testing defenses, seeking opportunities. Small-scale raids have been reported sporadically, individual ships landing on remote beaches, attacking isolated farmsteads or small settlements, taking what they could carry, and leaving before any organized resistance could be mounted. But these earlier raids were small-scale, almost tentative, the work of individual captains testing the waters, seeing what resistance they might face, learning the geography and the patterns of settlement. But this attack on Lindisfarne is different. This is not just another raid on an isolated farmstead or fishing village. Attacking a monastery, a place explicitly dedicated to God, sends a shockwave of horror rippling across Christian Europe. The psychological impact is profound, far exceeding the material damage done. If even the holiest places, the houses of God himself, are not safe from these northern raiders, then nowhere is truly secure. The news of the raid spreads quickly, carried by travelers and merchants, by messengers sent from one monastery to another, warning of the new threat. Scholars and churchmen throughout Christendom react with shock and outrage. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin, who is serving at the court of Charlemagne in Francia when he hears the news, writes letters expressing his horror and interpreting the raid as divine punishment for the sins of the English people. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, as we have now suffered from a pagan race, he writes. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. For historians looking back across the centuries, trying to understand the broad sweep of European history, this bloody raid on Lindisfarne has come to serve as the opening act, the symbolic beginning of what they call the Viking Age. It's a convenient marker, a dramatic event that signals the start of a new era. Of course, history doesn't really work in such neat packages. There were Viking activities before 793, and the patterns that would characterize the Viking Age were already developing. But the Lindisfarne raid captures the imagination, provides a clear moment to point to and say, here, this is when it began. For the next few centuries, roughly from 793 to 1066, you see these warriors from Scandinavia turn Europe upside down. They appear seemingly everywhere, their dragon-proud ships materializing like nightmares on coastlines and rivers from Ireland to Constantinople, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. They're raiders, yes, attacking monasteries and towns, carrying away treasure and slaves. But they're also traders, establishing commercial networks that stretch from Baghdad to Dublin, exchanging furs and amber and slaves for silver and silk and spices. They're explorers, venturing into the unknown waters of the North Atlantic, discovering and settling Iceland and Greenland, even reaching the shores of North America 5 centuries before Columbus. And increasingly, as the Viking Age progresses, they're conquerors and settlers, establishing permanent kingdoms and territories throughout the lands they once only raided. England, in particular, bears the brunt of Viking attention. The island is wealthy by the standards of the early medieval period, with productive agricultural lands, thriving monasteries filled with treasures, and a political structure that by the early 9th century has fragmented into several competing kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, each sometimes allied with, sometimes fighting against the other. This fragmentation makes England vulnerable. There's no unified response to Viking raids, no coordinated defense strategy. Each kingdom must fend for itself, and individually, none is strong enough to effectively resist sustained Viking pressure. The process of Viking conquest in England is gradual but relentless. It begins in earnest in 865, more than 70 years after the Lindisfarne raid, when a massive force that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army lands in East Anglia. This is no mere raiding party, but an invasion force numbering in the thousands, accompanied not just by warriors, but by their families, and by all the support personnel necessary to sustain a long campaign. They've come not just to plunder, but to conquer, to establish permanent settlements, to carve out kingdoms for themselves in this fertile, wealthy land. Over the next 15 years, this army and the forces that join it or follow it systematically conquer most of England. Northumbria falls, its king killed. East Anglia is conquered, its king, Edmund, executed in a manner that will lead to his later veneration as a saint and martyr. Mercia is subdued, its kings reduced to puppet rulers or driven out entirely. Only Wessex, under the determined resistance of King Alfred, who will earn the epithet the Great largely through his success in resisting the Vikings, manages to maintain its independence, and even Wessex comes close to being overwhelmed on several occasions. By the early 11th century, the process that began with raids has culminated in conquest. England falls under the rule of a Danish king, Sinut the Great, who creates a vast North Sea empire encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had ruled England since the 5th century, since the collapse of Roman Britain, are swept away or absorbed into this Scandinavian realm. But England is only part of the story. In France, Vikings establish a permanent presence as well. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo negotiates an agreement with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. In exchange for defending northern France against other Viking raids and for converting to Christianity, Rollo receives a large territory that will become known as Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. Within a few generations, Rollo's descendants have adopted French language and culture, becoming thoroughly assimilated. But they retain something of their Viking heritage, the martial prowess and the ambition that drove their ancestors. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy will conquer England, establishing a new dynasty and fundamentally reshaping English society, language, and culture. The Norman conquest is, in a sense, a delayed Viking conquest, achieved by men who were descended from Vikings, even if they no longer thought of themselves as such. By the year 1000, Viking fingerprints are everywhere across the map of Europe and beyond. In the West, they've reached the forgotten corners of the North Atlantic, establishing a settlement in Greenland that will endure for centuries and even landing on the shores of North America, in a place they call Vinland, though these American settlements will be temporary, abandoned after a few years due to conflict with the indigenous peoples and the sheer distance from Scandinavia. In the east, Swedish Vikings called the Rus have established kingdoms along the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, creating trade routes that connect Scandinavia to Constantinople and Baghdad, bringing northern furs and amber and slaves south in exchange for silver, silk, and spices. The Viking Age finally sputters to an end in 1066, though the date is somewhat arbitrary, and the process of ending is gradual rather than abrupt. The symbolic endpoint is the death of Harald Hardrada, perhaps the last great Viking warrior king, a man whose life embodied the Viking ideal of the far-travelled warrior who fought in many lands for treasure and fame. Harald, King of Norway, launches an invasion of England in September 1066, claiming the English throne on dubious grounds. He lands in the north with a large army and initially achieves some success, but King Harold Godwinson of England marches north to meet him. The two armies clash at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, and the English achieve a decisive victory. Harald Hardrada is killed in the fighting, along with most of his army. The irony is that Harold Godwinson's victory at Stamford Bridge leaves his own army exhausted and depleted, and he has to immediately march south again to face another invasion. William of Normandy has landed on the south coast with his own army of conquest. 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold is defeated and killed at the Battle of Hastings, and William becomes King of England. So, in a sense, the Viking Age ends with a Viking victory, though William and his Normans no longer thought of themselves as Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxons didn't recognize them as such. After 1066, the character of Scandinavian expansion changes. The age of riding is over. The Scandinavian kingdoms themselves are becoming more centralized, more Christian, more integrated into the broader European political and cultural world. Kings have more control over their subjects and can prevent the kind of independent raiding expeditions that characterized the early Viking Age. Christianity, which is becoming the dominant religion throughout Scandinavia by the 11th century, brings with it a prohibition against raiding Christian lands, and by now, most of Europe is at least nominally Christian. History begins to fade into stories. The actual events, the raids and battles and conquests, start to be remembered less as precise historical facts and more as general narratives, as tales of a heroic age, when men were braver, when adventures were grander, when fame and glory were there for the taking for anyone with the courage to seize them. Stories fade into legends, and legends begin to take on lives of their own, evolving with each retelling, acquiring embellishments and mythological elements, merging with older stories from the pre-Christian past. During the 13th and 14th centuries, mostly in Iceland, which has by now become a center of literary culture and historical writing, scribes begin the painstaking work of writing down the old tales, the sagas that have been passed down through generations by word of mouth. These Icelandic scribes are scholars and literary artists working in a culture that highly values both historical knowledge and literary craft. They're writing in Old Norse, using the Latin alphabet that came to Scandinavia with Christianity, but adapting it to represent the sounds of their own language. The sagas they produce are among the great literary achievements of the Middle Ages. They tell of the legendary kings of the Viking Age, of their heroic deeds and their tragic flaws, of battles won and lost, of loves and betrayals, of the complex web of honor and revenge that governed Viking society. Some sagas focus on specific families, tracing their histories over multiple generations. Others tell of the settlement of Iceland, preserving memories of the founding fathers of Icelandic society. Still, others focus on individual heroes and kings, creating biographical narratives that blend historical memory with literary invention. And a few of these sagas speak of a king who supposedly ruled Sweden and Denmark, who led devastating raids on England, whose story was told for generations and is still being told today, adapted and readapted for each new age that discovers him. A legendary Viking king named Ragnar Lothbrok, whose very name evokes the entire Viking Age, whose story has become inseparable from the larger story of Viking expansion and conquest, whose sons supposedly conquered England and whose descendants supposedly ruled Scandinavian kingdoms for generations. Ragnar Lothbrok stands at the center of some of the most famous sagas, the subject of his own saga, and a major character in several others. He is depicted as a great warrior and a clever tactician, as a man who wins his wives through heroic deeds and cunning, as a father of sons who will become even more famous than he is, and ultimately as a martyr whose death sparks the greatest Viking invasion in history. He embodies the Viking ideal, while also revealing the costs of that ideal, the way that a life devoted to war and glory inevitably involves suffering and loss. But who was Ragnar Lothbrok, really? Did he exist as a historical person, or is he a legend, a composite character created by later generations for their own purposes? To answer that question, or rather to understand why it cannot be definitively answered, you need to understand both the sources that preserve his story and the historical context in which those sources were created. You need to trace his legend back through the centuries, seeing how it evolved and changed, how it served different purposes for different generations, how it reflects both historical memory and political necessity. Let yourself drift now into the world of the Sagas, into the Iceland of the 13th century, where monks and scholars are writing down the old stories, trying to preserve something of the heroic age before it's lost forever. Picture them in their halls, writing by the light of whale oil lamps during the long, dark winters, their hands cramping from the cold and from the hours of careful writing, creating manuscripts that will preserve these stories for future generations to puzzle over. Chapter 2. The Genealogy of a Legend. Most of the sagas that tell Ragnar's tale begin not with Ragnar himself, but with his ancestors, tracing his lineage back through the generations, creating a family tree that connects him to the legendary kings and heroes of Scandinavia's mythological past. This genealogical approach was typical of saga literature and of medieval thought more generally. A person's identity was understood largely in terms of their ancestry, their family connections, the lineage that both explained who they were and constrained what they could become. According to the sagas, Ragnar's ancestry reaches back to Ivar Vidfamne, a legendary king whose very name suggests vast reach. Vidfamne means something like wide grasping or far traveling. Ivar Vidfamne supposedly ruled over a huge realm stretching across much of Scandinavia and possibly beyond, though the details are vague and clearly more mythological than historical. He represents the kind of idealized king that saga audiences admired: powerful, far-traveled, successful in war, capable of holding together a vast realm through a combination of military prowess and political skill. But the genealogy from Ivar Vidfamne to Ragnar gets tangled here, like a family tree hit by a storm, with branches crossing and recrossing in ways that defy simple chronology or easy verification. Different sagas give different versions of the family relationships, sometimes contradicting each other on crucial points. This confusion is partly due to the complexity of Viking kinship systems, which recognized relationships through both male and female lines, and which were further complicated by the practice of polygamy and concubinage among the elite. But it's also due to the fact that these genealogies were often constructed or manipulated for political purposes, to establish connections between contemporary rulers and legendary heroes of the past. According to one version of the genealogy, Ivar Vidfamne's granddaughter marries a Slavic king, an interesting detail that suggests connections between Scandinavian and Slavic royal families in the legendary past, perhaps reflecting actual historical interactions between these peoples. Their son is Sigurdring, who will become one of the great warrior kings of Scandinavian legend in his own right. Sigurdring's moment of greatest fame comes at the Battle of Bravelir, which is described in the sagas as one of the largest and most important battles in Scandinavian history. The details of this battle, as preserved in the sagas, are almost certainly heavily embellished, but the core event might have some historical basis. According to the saga accounts, the battle pit Sigurd Ring against his uncle, Harald Wartooth, who has been king of Denmark and Sweden. The battle is presented as a generational conflict, the younger hero challenging the older king, but it's also described as a kind of apocalyptic confrontation, where warriors from all over Scandinavia come to fight on one side or the other. The saga descriptions of the battle are vivid and detailed, describing formations and tactics, individual duels between named champions, the terrible casualties on both sides. Harald Wartooth is said to be extremely old by the time of the battle, so old that he has to be carried to the battlefield in a chariot. But he insists on fighting rather than dying peacefully in his bed, preferring a warrior's death that will earn him a place in Valhalla. During the battle, his own charioteer, who is actually Odin in disguise, though Harald doesn't realize this, kills him, and Sigurd Ring achieves victory. After this great battle, Sigurd Ring unites Denmark and Sweden under his rule, creating one of the first attempts at a Scandinavian superkingdom, a political unity that will be attempted repeatedly throughout medieval Scandinavian history, though rarely achieved for long. The saga suggests he reigns from around 770 to 804, though these dates should be taken as approximations at best, extrapolated from fragmentary information and later traditions rather than from reliable contemporary records. Sigurd Ring marries a woman named Alfhild, and from this union, according to the saga tradition, Ragnar Lothbrok is born. The name Alfhild means something like elf battle, reflecting the Norse belief that names should be meaningful, should say something about the person or their destiny, or the hopes their parents had for them. If we accept the traditional chronology, this would place Ragnar's birth somewhere in the late 8th century, probably sometime between 770 and 800, making him a contemporary of the very beginning of the Viking Age. But here's where the historical problems begin to multiply, where the neat narrative of the sagas starts to break down under close examination. The genealogy connecting Ragnar to Sigurd Ring and beyond to Ivar Vidfamne appears only in late sources, written centuries after the supposed events. No contemporary source from the 9th century mentions Ragnar's parentage or connects him to any particular lineage. The genealogy might be accurate, preserving genuine historical memory that was passed down orally for generations before being written down. But it might also be a later invention, created to give Ragnar the kind of prestigious ancestry that a legendary king was expected to have. Now, here's something that reveals a great deal about what the saga authors thought was important in telling Ragnar's story. The sagas don't focus much on Ragnar's battles or his military exploits in the way you might expect for a legendary warrior king. Yes, battles are mentioned, and Ragnar is depicted as a formidable fighter and a clever military commander. But the sagas are actually more interested in his complicated personal life, in his relationships with his wives and sons, in the domestic and dynastic aspects of his story, rather than the strictly military ones. This might seem surprising to modern audiences raised on action movies and military history, but it reflects something important about saga values and about what medieval Scandinavian audiences found interesting. The sagas were not just adventure stories or military chronicles. They were complex narratives about families, about how relationships between people shaped historical events, about the way that personal decisions rippled outward to affect entire societies. The sagas understood that wars were fought not in a vacuum, but within a context of kinship obligations, marriage alliances, inheritance disputes, and personal grievances that were often more important than abstract political or territorial goals. Ragnar's wives in particular are depicted as extraordinary characters with compelling stories of their own, women who are far from passive prizes to be won, but are instead active participants in shaping events, sometimes driving the narrative forward more than Ragnar himself does. Medieval Scandinavian culture or at least the literary culture that produced the sagas, had a complex attitude toward women that combined patriarchal assumptions with genuine respect for female strength and capability. Women in the sagas are often depicted as wise counselors, as agents of revenge when their male relatives fail to act, as prophets who see what men cannot, as powerful personalities who must be reckoned with. Ragnar's first wife, according to most versions of the saga, is named Thora, sometimes called Thora Townheart, a name that suggests both beauty and a certain untamed quality. The story of how Ragnar won Thora's hand has become one of the most famous episodes in the entire Ragnar legend. A tale that has been retold countless times, and that has become a template for the hero's proving himself worthy of the princess. According to the saga, Thora was the daughter of a Swedish nobleman named Herod, a jarl who ruled over substantial lands and who had ambitions for his daughter to marry well, to make an alliance that would benefit his house. As a young girl, Thora received a gift that would change her life and create the circumstances for her eventual marriage to Ragnar. The gift was a small lindworm, a type of serpent or dragon in Norse mythology, smaller and less powerful than the great dragons of legend, but still dangerous and magical. The person who gave her this gift, the saga isn't always clear on the details, suggested she should keep it in a small box, laying it upon gold, for it was said that dragons and serpents had an affinity for treasure, that they grew larger and stronger when they could rest upon gold and silver. Thora, delighted with her unusual pet, followed this advice. She placed the lindworm in a box, lined with a small amount of gold, and cared for it, feeding it regularly. The creature grew, as dragons do in legend, and it grew remarkably fast, almost unnaturally so. Soon it was too large for its original box, and had to be moved to a larger enclosure. Thora's father, Herod, provided more gold for it to rest upon, and the creature continued to grow. The servants who were tasked with feeding it began to fear the monster they were tending, this serpent that seemed to double in size every few months, that had developed venomous fangs and a temperament that was becoming increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. Eventually, the serpent grew so large and so fierce that it coiled itself entirely around Thora's bower, the private chambers where she lived in her father's hall. The creature had become so massive that its body, coiled around the building, formed a living wall, scales gleaming in the sunlight, its head raised high, its forked tongue flickering out to taste the air, its eyes cold and reptilian and utterly without mercy. It would allow no one to approach, guarding Thora not as a protector, but as a jealous beast claiming treasure for itself, for dragons in Norse mythology were notoriously possessive of their hoards, and saw no distinction between gold and jewels, and the princess who slept atop the gold. Thora became, in effect, a prisoner of the very creature she had once kept as a pet. She could not leave her bower, could not receive visitors, could not live any kind of normal life. Her father, Herod, was distraught but helpless. He was a warrior, skilled in battle against human enemies, but this was beyond his experience or capability. His warriors were brave men who had faced shield walls and sword storms without flinching, but none dared approach the massive serpent that could kill with its venomous bite, that could crush a man in the coils of its body, that seemed to be growing larger and more dangerous with each passing day. In desperation, Herod proclaimed that anyone who could kill the serpent and free his daughter would have Thora's hand in marriage, along with a substantial portion of his wealth and lands. It was a classic challenge from heroic literature, the kind of quest that heroes are supposed to undertake, the monster that must be defeated, the princess who needs rescuing, the father who will reward the successful hero with wealth and a dynastic marriage. The proclamation went out across Sweden and beyond, carried by traders and travelers, becoming the kind of news that spreads quickly because it offers opportunity to ambitious young men looking to make their fortunes. Many warriors came to attempt the challenge. They came from all over Scandinavia, drawn by the promise of marriage to a noble's daughter and the wealth that would come with it. But one by one, they failed. Some were driven back by the serpent before they could even get close enough to strike at it. Others managed to wound it, but were killed by its counterattacks, crushed in its coils or poisoned by its venom. The area around Thora's bower became littered with the bodies of failed heroes, a grim testament to the difficulty of the task and the power of the creature that guarded her. Ragnar, hearing of this challenge, decided that this was an opportunity worthy of his ambition. But what makes the story interesting, what reveals Ragnar's character as the Sagas depict it, is not just that he decided to attempt the challenge, but how he approached it. He didn't simply rush in with sword and courage, relying on martial prowess and luck. Instead, he thought carefully about the problem, analyzed the nature of the threat, and came up with a creative solution. The primary dangers posed by the serpent were its venomous bite and the crushing power of its coils. Ordinary armor might provide some protection against the bite, but it wouldn't be enough against a creature of this size, and it would provide no protection at all against being crushed. Ragnar needed something different, some kind of protection that would be flexible enough to allow movement, but tough enough to resist both venom and physical pressure. He had special clothing made, garments that would become famous in legend, and that would give him his enduring nickname. Different versions of the saga describe these garments differently. The details vary depending on which manuscript you're reading and when it was written, but the basic concept remains consistent. Ragnar had trousers and perhaps a tunic made from leather or thick cloth, and then these garments were treated in a special way to make them resistant to the serpent's attacks. According to most versions, the clothing was boiled in pitch or tar, that sticky black substance derived from pine trees, the same material used to waterproof ships and to seal the gaps between planks. The garments were soaked thoroughly in this pitch while it was still hot and liquid, allowing it to penetrate deep into the fibers of the material. Then, while the pitch was still somewhat sticky, the garments were rolled in coarse sand, coating them completely. The result was a kind of improvised armor, flexible enough to allow movement, but with a rough, tough surface that would resist both the serpent's fangs and its coils. The pitch would also create a barrier against venom, preventing it from soaking through to Ragnar's skin. These shaggy breeches or hairy trousers, the literal meaning of Lothbrok or Lothbrok, would become Ragnar's defining characteristic, the source of his famous nickname. It's worth noting that this nickname suggests a certain earthy humor in Viking culture. Here's a man who will become a legendary king, and he's known by a name that essentially means shaggy pants. It's not particularly dignified or poetic, but it's memorable, and it connects him to this specific heroic deed. Dressed in his protective clothing, armed with a spear, the reach of a spear would allow him to strike at the serpent while staying as far from its fangs as possible. Ragnar approached the serpent. The creature, which had been dozing in the sun, coiled around Thora's bower, was roused by his approach. It reared up to strike, uncoiling itself partially, its head rising high into the air, its mouth opening to reveal fangs as long as daggers dripping with venom. Ragnar didn't try to avoid the attack, but instead met it head-on. As the serpent struck, he drove his spear deep into its body, aiming for vital areas, using his specially prepared clothing to protect himself from the creature's thrashing. The battle was fierce and desperate. The serpent coiled around him, trying to crush him, but the treated leather of his clothing was tough enough to resist, and the sand coating made it difficult for the creature to get a good grip. The serpent's fangs caught in the thick material, but couldn't penetrate to Ragnar's skin. The venom dripped and ran, staining the pitch-soaked leather, but not reaching the flesh beneath. Ragnar struck again and again with his spear, driving it deep into the serpent's body, seeking its heart or other vital organs. The creature's blood, hot and stinking, poured out over him, but he didn't falter. Finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity of desperate struggle, the serpent's movements began to slow. Its coils loosened their grip. Its head drooped, no longer able to rise for another strike. With a final convulsive shudder, the creature died, its massive body lying in bloody coils around Thora's bower. Harold, true to his word, gave his daughter to Ragnar in marriage. The wedding must have been a grand affair, a Jarl of Sweden giving his daughter to a young hero who had accomplished what dozens of other warriors had failed to do. Ragnar had proven himself worthy, not just through strength, but through intelligence and creativity, through his ability to analyze a problem and devise a solution. These were the qualities that would supposedly serve him well throughout his career, making him not just a successful warrior, but a great king. According to the Sagas, Ragnar and Thora were very happy together. Happiness in saga literature is often briefly mentioned rather than dwelt upon. The sagas are more interested in conflicts and tensions than in domestic contentment, but the impression is of a genuine partnership, a marriage based on mutual respect as well as romantic attraction. Thora bore Ragnar sons. The sagas differ on their names and later fates, with some versions giving detailed accounts of their lives, while others mention them only in passing. But these sons from Ragnar's first marriage would not be the ones who would become most famous in legend. This happiness was not destined to last. In some versions of the tale, Thora dies of illness, while Ragnar is away on a raiding expedition, one of those sudden diseases that were so common in the medieval world, and that could carry off even the young and healthy within days. In other versions, she simply fades from the narrative, mentioned briefly and then no more, as the story moves on to Ragnar's other wives and the sons who would become the focus of the later parts of his legend. The saga tradition was not particularly interested in maintaining continuity or in providing closure for every character. People appeared, played their parts, and then disappeared, just as in real life, where not every story has a neat ending. But the serpent-slaying tale remains one of the most vivid and memorable episodes in the entire Ragnar legend. It establishes several important things about Ragnar's character as the sagas depict him. First, it shows him as a hero in the traditional mold, a monster slayer like Sigurd before him, and Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon tradition. This connection to earlier heroic patterns would have been immediately recognized by saga audiences, who knew these stories and understood the resonances. Second, it shows Ragnar as clever and practical, not just brave. He doesn't rely on brute strength alone, but uses his intelligence to solve a problem, to find a way to overcome an enemy that cannot be defeated through conventional means. This combination of courage and cunning becomes a hallmark of the legendary Ragnar, distinguishing him from simpler warrior heroes who triumph through strength alone. Third, the story provides an origin for his famous nickname, grounding it in a specific heroic deed rather than in something mundane or accidental. The name Lothbrok becomes a badge of honor, a reminder of this great achievement every time someone uses it. And finally, the serpent-slaying tale connects Ragnar to older mythological patterns. The dragon guarding the maiden is an ancient motif found in countless cultures, from Greek myths to Christian saints' lives to Norse legends. By incorporating this element, the saga makers were deliberately placing Ragnar in a tradition of heroes that stretched back to the mythological age, suggesting that he belonged among the greatest figures of legend, that his story was cut from the same cloth as the most ancient and revered tales. The detail about the dragon lying on gold also echoes other Norse traditions, particularly the story of Fafnir, the dwarf who was transformed into a dragon and who guarded a cursed treasure hoard lying upon it possessively, growing larger and more monstrous over the years as greed consumed him. This parallel would not have been lost on saga audiences, who would have recognized the thematic connection between different dragon stories and their tradition. After Thor's death, the Sagas introduce another extraordinary woman into Ragnar's life, perhaps the most fascinating and controversial of all his wives, Lagertha, the shieldmaiden, who fought in battles alongside men and who would become in modern retellings of the Ragnar legend one of the most popular characters. But the historical and textual reality of Lagertha is even more complicated than that of Ragnar himself, raising questions about gender warfare and how medieval writers depicted extraordinary women. Chapter 3. The Shieldmaiden. Lagertha's story is found primarily in one source, the Gesta Danorum, a history of the Danes written in Latin by the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus in the late 12th or early 13th century. Saxo was a learned man, educated in the church, familiar with classical Latin literature and with the conventions of medieval historical writing. His work is ambitious in scope, attempting to provide a comprehensive history of Denmark from its legendary origins down to his own time, blending mythology, legend, and what historical facts he had access to into a continuous narrative. Saxo's treatment of the legendary material is interesting. He clearly didn't believe all the stories he was recording. His work contains asides and comments that suggest skepticism about the more fantastical elements. But he also understood that these stories were important to Danish identity and pride, that they served a cultural function, even if they couldn't be verified as historical fact. So he recorded them, sometimes rationalizing the more supernatural elements, or reinterpreting them in more naturalistic terms, but preserving the essential narratives. According to Saxo's account, Ragnar first encountered Lagertha during a military campaign that took place early in his career, perhaps soon after Thor's death, or possibly even before his marriage to Thora, depending on how you try to reconcile the chronology. A Swedish king named Fro had invaded Norway, killed the Norwegian king, and subjected the dead king's family to terrible humiliations. Among these humiliations was forcing the women of the royal household, who should have been treated with respect befitting their station, to work in a brothel, a degradation designed to utterly destroy their honor and the honor of their family. Ragnar allied with the Norwegian cause. The saga doesn't always make clear exactly why Ragnar involved himself in this conflict, whether he had Norwegian connections or political ambitions in Norway, or simply saw an opportunity to win glory and perhaps territory, came to take revenge on Fro. He assembled an army and prepared for battle. Before the decisive engagement, he was amazed to see that among the Norwegian forces were women warriors, shield maidens, who had taken up arms to avenge their kinsmen and to wash away the shame that had been inflicted on them. Shield maidens in Norse literature and legend are fascinating figures that raise complex questions about history and mythology. Did women actually fight in Viking Age warfare? The historical evidence is ambiguous. Most scholars believe that Viking warfare was overwhelmingly male, that the shield wall, the basic tactical formation of Viking Age combat, required strength and endurance that would have made female participation rare at best. But there are intriguing hints in the archaeological record, graves of women buried with weapons, though whether these weapons indicated actual warrior status or were symbolic or served some other purpose remains debated. The sagas themselves are contradictory on this point. Most of the time, warfare is depicted as exclusively male, but occasionally shield maidens appear, women who for various reasons, personal tragedy, desire for revenge, rejection of conventional female roles, take up weapons and fight alongside men. These shield maidens are always depicted as exceptional, as women who have chosen to step outside normal social boundaries, and they're treated with a mixture of admiration and unease by the male characters around them. Whether shield maidens represent historical reality, wish fulfillment fantasy, or perhaps echoes of older mythological patterns, where divine or semi-divine women warriors appear in the stories is difficult to determine. The Valkyries of Norse mythology were certainly warrior women, though they were supernatural beings rather than human. Perhaps the shieldmaidens of the Sagas are a kind of humanized version of the Valkyries, women who embody some of that divine martial prowess in mortal form. At the forefront of these Norwegian shield maidens, according to Saxo's account, was Lagertha. Saxo describes her in terms that emphasize both her beauty and her martial prowess, creating a figure who combines traditionally feminine attractiveness with masculine courage and skill in battle. This combination, the beautiful woman who is also a formidable warrior, becomes a standard trope in later literature, but in Saxo's telling it still has power because it's presented matter-of-factly as something unusual but not impossible. Saxo describes the battle in vivid terms, though his account is filtered through his education in classical literature, so the battle sometimes sounds more like something from Livy or Tacitus than from Norse tradition. Lagertha's role in the battle is emphasized. She fights with particular skill and ferocity, and her courage apparently inspires the men around her. The Norwegian forces, bolstered by the presence of these warrior women fighting for revenge and honor, achieve victory over the Swedish invaders. After the battle, Ragnar, according to Saxo's account, was immediately smitten with Lagertha, but this attraction was not based primarily on her physical beauty, though Saxo mentions that she was beautiful. Rather, Ragnar was attracted to her martial skill, her courage, her willingness to face death alongside the men. This detail is significant because it suggests that Ragnar valued strength and capability in his partners, that he was drawn to women who were extraordinary in some way, who stood out from the ordinary run of womankind. But Lagertha, being no ordinary woman, didn't make things easy for Ragnar. When he sought to court her, she set tests for him, challenges he would have to overcome to prove himself worthy of her. According to some versions of the tale, preserved by Saxo, she kept a bear and a great hound at her home, specifically to guard against unwanted suitors. These fierce beasts would attack anyone who tried to approach her dwelling without her permission. Ragnar, determined to win her, had to defeat these animal guardians before he could even speak with her properly. The motif of the hero overcoming guardians to win his bride appears again here, as it did in the story of Thora and the serpent. But there's an important difference. In Thora's case, the serpent was an external threat, a monster that had trapped her against her will. In Lagertha's case, the guardians are set by the bride herself, suggesting her agency and power, her ability to control her own circumstances and to set conditions for her own marriage. She's not a passive prize to be won, but an active participant in determining her own fate. Ragnar succeeded in the trials, defeating the bear and the hound, and he and Lagertha were married. Saxo suggests the marriage was happy, at least initially. Lagertha bore Ragnar at least one son. Saxo names him Fridleif, and 2 daughters, though the names of the daughters are not always given consistently in different manuscript versions of Saxo's work. For a time they were happy, with Lagertha managing Ragnar's lands and interests in Norway, while he went on expeditions elsewhere, a pattern that was common in Viking society, where men might be away for months or even years on trading voyages or military campaigns. But Saxo's account takes a darker turn. According to his narrative, Ragnar's feelings for Lagertha eventually changed. The saga doesn't always make clear exactly why this happened. Perhaps he was influenced by his advisors, who thought he should make a more politically advantageous marriage. Perhaps his own ambitions led him to seek an alliance with a more powerful family. Perhaps the relationship simply cooled over time, as relationships sometimes do. Whatever the cause, Ragnar decided to divorce Lagertha. Divorce in Viking society was actually relatively straightforward compared to Christian Europe, where marriage was considered a sacrament and divorce was either impossible or extremely difficult. In pagan Scandinavian law, either party could initiate a divorce for various reasons, though there were social and economic consequences. A divorced woman retained rights to her property and to support for her children, and her family might seek compensation if they felt she had been wronged. But divorce was certainly possible, and it carried less stigma than it did in Christian societies. Ragnar divorced Lagertha and married another woman. In some versions this is Thora, suggesting that Saxo's chronology differs from other saga traditions, while in other versions it's someone else entirely. Lagertha, according to Saxo's account, returned to Norway and to her own lands, which she had apparently maintained throughout her marriage to Ragnar. This detail suggests that she had been a woman of some independent means even before meeting Ragnar, not just a warrior, but someone with property and status in her own right. Lagertha didn't fade quietly into obscurity as many divorced women might have done. She remarried, taking a local earl as her husband, a man who presumably could help her maintain her position and protect her interests. But the saga suggests that she never forgot Ragnar, that their relationship, however it had ended, had marked her permanently. Years later, according to Saxo's account, Ragnar faced a difficult military situation. He was engaged in a war, the details vary depending on the version, and found himself outnumbered and in danger of defeat. Word of Ragnar's peril somehow reached Lagertha in Norway. She made a decision that reveals much about her character as Saxo depicts it. She assembled a fleet of ships and gathered warriors, and she sailed to Ragnar's aid. The scene of Lagertha's arrival must have been dramatic. Ragnar, hard-pressed by his enemies, suddenly sees ships approaching and doesn't know if they're reinforcements or additional enemies. Then Lagertha's forces join the battle, attacking Ragnar's enemies from an unexpected direction, and the tide of combat turns. With Lagertha's help, Ragnar achieves victory, turning what might have been a disastrous defeat into a triumph. After the battle, according to Saxo, Ragnar expressed regret for having left Lagertha. He had realized, perhaps too late, that she was an extraordinary woman, that his decision to divorce her had been a mistake driven by ambition or poor counsel or simply bad judgment. He sought reconciliation, suggesting that they might reunite, might put aside the divorce and restore their marriage. But Lagertha had changed in the years since their divorce. She had built a life for herself in Norway, had remarried, had established her own power base. She was no longer the young shieldmaiden who had fought alongside Ragnar in that first battle years before. She had become something else, a ruler in her own right, a woman who had learned that she didn't need Ragnar or any man to define her or to protect her. That night, according to Saxo's dramatic account, Lagertha killed her second husband. She took a spear, or possibly a knife, and murdered him as he slept, then declared herself sole ruler of his lands and hers, becoming an earl, or possibly a queen in her own right, ruling without need of a male consort or protector. Whether this was part of some long-planned scheme, had she married the earl always intending to kill him once she had secured her position, or whether it was a spontaneous decision made in the wake of seeing Ragnar again and realizing she no longer loved him or needed him, Saxo doesn't make entirely clear. What is clear is that Lagertha emerges from the story as a figure of formidable independence and ambition. She's not defined by her relationship to Ragnar, though that relationship is an important part of her story. She's a person in her own right, capable of violence and political calculation, of both fighting in battles and ruling territories, of both loving and killing. She's complex in a way that female characters in medieval literature often aren't given depth and agency that make her memorable and fascinating. The historical reality of Lagertha is even more questionable than that of Ragnar himself, if such a thing is possible. She appears in no other sources besides Saxo's Gesta Danorum. No other saga mentions her. No contemporary 9th century sources record a Norwegian shieldmaiden who married and divorced a Danish king. The name itself, Lagertha, or Lagerda, as Saxo writes it in his Latin, might be a Latinization of a Norse name, though scholars debate what the original form would have been, and whether it's even a plausible Norse name at all. Some scholars suggest that Lagertha might be entirely a literary invention by Saxo, perhaps inspired by mythological figures like the Valkyries or by scattered mentions in other sources of women who took up arms in exceptional circumstances, all woven together into a single compelling character that Saxo inserted into Ragnar's story. Other scholars think there might be some historical kernel, some memory of an actual woman warrior from the Viking Age, though her connection to Ragnar might be tenuous or invented. There's also a theory that Lagertha might be based on Thorgerd, a goddess or supernatural being who appears in some Norse sources and who was apparently worshipped in Norway, sometimes depicted with martial attributes. Perhaps Saxo encountered stories about Thorgerd and rationalized her into a human shieldmaiden, fitting her into his historical narrative while transforming her from goddess to mortal woman. Whatever her origin, Lagertha serves important functions in the Ragnar legend, as Saxo tells it. She establishes that Ragnar was attracted to extraordinary women, to capability and strength, rather than to passive beauty or conventional femininity. She adds complexity to his character, showing him making a decision, the divorce, that he later regrets, revealing human weakness alongside heroic strength. She provides a female character who is defined not by her victimization or her need for rescue, but by her own choices and actions, her own strength and agency. The inclusion of a shieldmaiden in Ragnar's story also tells us something about Norse culture, or at least about how later Scandinavians wanted to remember or imagine their Viking Age ancestors. Whether or not women actually fought in significant numbers during the Viking Age, the cultural tradition clearly valued the idea of women who could fight if necessary, who were not so different from men in their capacity for courage and violence, who could cross the gender boundaries that most societies enforced rigidly. In the quiet moments between battles and adventures, you can imagine Ragnar reflecting on these two extraordinary women who shaped his early life according to the saga tradition. Thora, whom he won through his courage and cleverness in slaying the serpent, and Lagertha, whom he won through martial prowess, but lost through his own poor judgment. Both relationships would have taught him something about the costs of the heroic life, the way that a life devoted to war and achievement often requires sacrifices in domestic happiness and personal connection. These stories of serpents and shield maidens, of tests and trials, of love found and lost, form an essential part of the Ragnar legend. They humanize the hero, making him more than just a successful warrior king. They show him as a man with desires and regrets, with both wisdom and foolishness, someone the audience can understand and empathize with even as they admire his legendary deeds. They provide the emotional core that makes the legend resonate across centuries, that allows each new generation to find something relevant and meaningful in this old story about a Viking king who may or may not have actually existed, but who certainly lives in imagination and in culture. Chapter 4. The Dragonslayer's Daughter. After his marriages to Thora and Lagertha, the Sagas introduce the woman who would become perhaps the most important of Ragnar's wives, certainly the most important in terms of the legend's later development. Aslaug, sometimes called Kraka in some versions of her story. Her tale is one of the most elaborate in the entire Ragnar cycle, involving disguise and prophecy and a lineage that connects directly to the most famous heroes and heroines of Norse mythology. Aslaug's story actually begins before she was born, with her parents, Sigurd the Dragonslayer and the Valkyrie Brynhildr. These two figures stand at the very heart of Norse heroic legend, their tragic love story preserved in multiple Eddic poems and prose sagas, their fame rivaling or exceeding even that of Ragnar himself in the medieval Scandinavian tradition. Sigurd was the greatest of all Norse heroes, a figure whose deeds were celebrated throughout Scandinavia and beyond. His most famous achievement was slaying the dragon Fafnir, a creature that had once been a dwarf, but had been transformed by greed and the curse on his treasure hoard into a terrible dragon that terrorized the land. Sigurd killed Fafnir, bathed in the dragon's blood, which made his skin invulnerable wherever it touched him, except for one spot on his back where a leaf had fallen. After slaying Fafnir, Sigurd went on to other adventures, eventually finding a Valkyrie named Brynhilda, who had been cursed to sleep surrounded by a ring of fire until a hero brave enough to cross the flames awakened her. Sigurd, protected by his dragon blood invulnerability, or perhaps simply by his tremendous courage, rode through the flames and woke Brynhilda. They fell in love and swore oaths to each other, promising to love only each other for as long as they lived. But their love was doomed by magic and misunderstanding and betrayal, by the machinations of others, and by the curse on Sigurd's treasure. Through the use of magical potions, Sigurd was tricked into forgetting Brynhilda and marrying another woman, Gudrun, daughter of Queen Grinha. He even helped Gudrun's brother Gunnar win Brynhilda for himself, riding through the flames in Gunnar's shape, so that Gunnar could claim to have performed the feat required to win her. When Brynhilda learned that Sigurd had married another woman, that he had broken his oaths to her, whether through magic or of his own will, her heart broke. She felt betrayed beyond endurance, dishonored, her love transformed into bitter hatred. She arranged for Sigurd's murder, convincing Gunnar's brother Guttorm to kill him. Guttorm struck Sigurd with a sword, targeting the one vulnerable spot on his back, and the greatest hero of the Norse tradition died in his bed, murdered by treachery rather than falling gloriously in battle. Immediately after Sigurd's death, Brynhilda was overcome with grief and remorse. She realized that she still loved him, that revenge had brought no satisfaction, only emptiness and more pain. She killed herself, requesting that she be burned on Sigurd's funeral pyre so that they could be together in death, since they had been kept apart in life. Her request was honored, and she and Sigurd were burned together, their love story ending in flames as it had begun, with Sigurd riding through the ring of fire to claim her. This is one of the great tragic love stories of medieval European literature, told and retold in multiple versions, influencing later works including the Nibelungenlied in Germany, and eventually inspiring Richard Wagner's opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen in the 19th century. But for our purposes, the important detail is that according to the saga tradition that connects to Ragnar's story, Sigurd and Brynhilda had a daughter before their tragic ends, Aslaug. Some versions of the tale suggest she was born after Sigurd's death, others that she was still an infant when her father was killed. Either way, she was orphaned at a very young age, left without parents in a dangerous world, and as the daughter of such famous heroes, and as the heiress to Sigurd's cursed treasure, she was in considerable danger. Powerful men would want to control her, to claim her inheritance, to use her lineage for their own purposes. An old couple, poor but kind-hearted, found the orphan child and took her in. But they feared that if anyone knew they were harboring the daughter of Sigurd the Dragonslayer, and more importantly, if anyone knew about the treasure that should be her inheritance, powerful men would come to claim both the child and the gold. They decided the safest course was to hide her identity completely, to raise her as their own granddaughter, to make sure no one suspected her true heritage. They dressed her in rags, deliberately making her look poor and neglected. They dirtied her face with soot and ash, hiding her natural beauty beneath layers of grime. They told everyone she was their own granddaughter, born to them in their old age through some unlikely circumstance. They named her Kraka, meaning crow, a deliberately humble name, the sort of name you'd give to a peasant child, not to the daughter of legendary heroes. To further disguise her noble bearing and natural grace, they gave her rough work to do. The kind of menial labor that would keep her bent and tired, that would callous her hands and bow her shoulders. Aslaug grew up as a peasant child, helping with the daily labor that kept the old couple alive. She fetched water, tended whatever small garden they had, did the endless chores that characterized peasant life. But despite their efforts to hide her nature, she remained extraordinary. Even beneath the dirt and the ragged clothing, even with her hands roughened by work, there was something about her that suggested she was more than she appeared. The old couple who raised her eventually died, as old people do, and Aslaug was left alone in their humble home. She continued to support herself as best she could, maintaining the disguise they had created for her, living a life of poverty and obscurity in a small settlement somewhere in Scandinavia. The saga
isn't always clear on the exact location.
Meanwhile, Ragnar Lothbrok, by now a king with considerable lands and power, with a growing reputation as a successful warrior and leader, was undertaking one of his expeditions. His ship stopped to resupply at the place where Aslaug lived in her peasant disguise. His men went ashore to gather provisions, fresh water, food, if they could trade for it or take it, perhaps to make minor repairs to the ships. While ashore, some of Ragnar's men encountered Kraka, as she called herself. Even in her ragged appearance, even with her face dirty and her clothing poor, there was something about her that caught their attention. Different versions of the tale described this encounter differently. In some versions, they saw her bathing in a stream and realized that beneath the dirt and poor clothing was a woman of exceptional beauty. In other versions, they were simply struck by something in her bearing or her voice, some quality that suggested nobility despite her circumstances. They returned to Ragnar and told him about this mysterious peasant woman who seemed somehow more than she appeared. Ragnar, intrigued, perhaps bored with the routine of his expedition, perhaps always alert to the unusual and the potentially profitable, summoned her to his ship. He wanted to see for himself what his men had found so remarkable about a peasant girl. What happened next varies depending on which version of the saga you follow, but all versions emphasize Aslaug's intelligence as much as her beauty or her noble lineage. Ragnar, testing her, gave her seemingly impossible commands, riddles that she would have to solve to prove herself worthy of his attention. This motif, the hero or king who tests a potential bride with riddles or impossible tasks, appears in many cultures and reflects something deep about how societies thought about marriage, about the importance of not just beauty or wealth, but intelligence and wit in a potential partner. Ragnar told her to come to him, neither clothed nor naked, neither hungry nor full, neither alone nor in company. These were the classic impossible conditions, paradoxes that seemed to have no solution. A lesser person would have been stumped, would have had to admit defeat and slink away in embarrassment. But Aslaug solved the riddles with cleverness worthy of her heroic heritage. She came to him wrapped only in her long hair and a fishing net. She was neither properly clothed, the net and her hair covered her, but weren't clothing in the conventional sense, nor completely naked, since she was covered. She had tasted food, but not eaten a full meal, satisfying the condition of being neither hungry nor full. And she brought a dog with her, so she was neither alone. The dog was company, nor in the company of another person. Ragnar was impressed. Here was someone who could match wits with him, who could solve problems creatively, who combined intelligence with the ability to think unconventionally. These were qualities he valued, perhaps even more than beauty or noble birth, though Aslaug would prove to have both of those as well. Impressed by her wit and increasingly intrigued by this woman who was clearly more than she appeared, Ragnar proposed marriage. But Aslaug, whether because she wanted to test him in return or because she had something to prove about her own worth and identity, set her own condition. She told him that she was not just a poor peasant girl, not just someone clever who could solve riddles. She was actually the daughter of Sigurd Fafnersbane, the dragonslayer, and of the Valkyrie Brynhilda. She was making a claim to one of the most illustrious lineages in all of Norse legend, asserting that she carried the blood of the greatest hero and one of the most famous women in Scandinavian tradition. Ragnar was skeptical. This was a bold claim, and many women might try to claim such distinguished parentage as a way to improve their circumstances. How could this peasant woman, living in poverty in an obscure settlement, possibly be the daughter of Sigurd? If she really carried such a lineage, why was she living in such reduced circumstances? Where was the famous treasure that Sigurd had taken from Fafnir? But Aslaug offered proof. The nature of this proof varies in different versions. Some suggest she demonstrated knowledge that only someone raised in Sigurd's tradition would have, detailed information about her parents' lives that couldn't have been common knowledge. Perhaps she even showed him some token or heirloom that had belonged to her parents, something the old couple who raised her had hidden away and that she had kept through all her years of poverty. Eventually, Ragnar was convinced, or at least convinced enough to proceed with the marriage. The potential benefits of marrying the daughter of Sigurd, the dragonslayer, of connecting his lineage to that legendary hero, were too great to pass up, even if there remained some uncertainty about her claims. But Aslaug also made a prophecy, demonstrating the supernatural insight that might be expected from the daughter of a Valkyrie. For Brynhilda had been a Valkyrie before her punishment of being surrounded by fire, and such beings were known for their ability to see fate and prophecy. Aslaug told Ragnar that if he consummated their marriage before 3 days had passed, the child conceived would be born with a serious affliction. She didn't specify what the affliction would be, only that it would mark the child throughout his life. This prophecy put Ragnar in a difficult position. He was impatient with desire. Aslaug was beautiful once the dirt was washed away and proper clothing restored to her, and he was eager to consummate the marriage. But she had warned him explicitly that premature consummation would result in a cursed or afflicted child. Should he heed her warning and wait the 3 days? Or should he follow his desire and risk the consequences? Ragnar, in a moment of weakness or perhaps of hubris, disregarded the warning. He took Aslaug to his bed before the 3 days were up, unable or unwilling to wait, perhaps doubting the truth of her prophecy, or simply prioritizing his immediate desire over future consequences. This decision would have profound effects on his future and on the course of the legend. The result of this union, as Aslaug had prophesied, was Ivar, who would be born with bones that never hardened properly, making him unable to walk without assistance. The Sagas call him Ivar the Boneless, though scholars have debated for centuries what this nickname really meant. Some suggest it indicates extreme flexibility, a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, where the bones remain soft and flexible rather than hardening normally. Others propose it's a poetic way of describing his disability, a physical condition that prevented normal mobility. Still, other scholars suggest boneless might not be literal at all, but rather a metaphorical description of some other characteristic, perhaps his cunning and flexibility in strategy, his ability to adapt and bend like something boneless rather than breaking like rigid bone. Or perhaps it was even a sexual innuendo, though this interpretation is less common in scholarly literature. Whatever the precise meaning of his nickname, the sagas are clear that despite his physical limitations, Ivar would become the most cunning, and in some ways, the most formidable of all Ragnar's sons. His disability would force him to develop his intelligence, to rely on strategy and planning rather than personal martial prowess, to lead through cunning and force of will rather than through the ability to physically dominate others in the shield wall. After Ivar, Aslaug bore Ragnar several more sons, And these would become the most famous of his children, the ones whose names and deeds would be preserved in both saga and historical record. Bjorn Ironside, whose nickname suggests either that he was protected in battle by some kind of enchantment, or simply that he was extremely tough and resilient. Fitzurk, whose name means white shirt, though the origin of this nickname is obscure. Ragmald, whose name means ruler of powerful advice or something similar, suggesting wisdom or political acumen, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, whose distinctive nickname supposedly came from a mark in his eye that resembled a serpent biting its own tail, like the world serpent Jormungandr of Norse mythology. She raises their sons to be strong and ambitious, instilling in them both pride in their extraordinary lineage and the skills they would need to make their own marks on the world. She tells them stories of their grandfather Sigurd, of his great deeds and his tragic end. She teaches them that they carry heroic blood, that greatness is expected of them, that they must live up to the legacy of their ancestors. This kind of education, emphasizing lineage and inherited qualities, was typical of aristocratic child-rearing in the medieval period. But in the case of Ragnar's sons, it was amplified by the truly extraordinary nature of their claimed ancestry. Yet the saga also suggests tension in the marriage, though this is handled subtly, more implied than explicitly stated. Ragnar is frequently away, sailing the seas, conquering new lands, building his reputation. Aslaug is left to manage everything at home, a role that requires its own form of courage and wisdom, but that doesn't bring the glory that comes from battlefield victories. The saga hints at Ragnar's occasional infidelities, his attraction to other women he encounters on his travels, though Aslaug apparently tolerated these as part of the price of being married to a legendary hero, as something that came with the territory. There's also the issue of Ragnar's relationship with his sons. As they grow up and begin their own careers as warriors and raiders, as their fame starts to spread, Ragnar experiences a complex mixture of pride and jealousy. He's proud of what they've accomplished, proud that his bloodline is producing such formidable warriors. But he's also increasingly aware that his own fame is being eclipsed, that people are starting to talk more about the sons of Ragnar than about Ragnar himself. This psychological dynamic, the aging father whose sons surpass him, the hero who finds his legacy overshadowed by the next generation, is handled with considerable sophistication in the sagas. It's a universal human experience, the way that parents can be simultaneously proud of and threatened by their children's success, especially when that success surpasses their own achievements. The sagas understand this, and they use it to create a compelling psychological portrait of Ragnar in his later years, a man grappling with his own aging and mortality, with the realization that his time of greatest glory is in the past. The story of Aslaug is significant for several reasons beyond the immediate plot. First, it connects Ragnar directly to the older heroic tradition through marriage, making him not just a successful Viking raider, but the son-in-law of the greatest hero in Norse legend. This genealogical connection would have been immensely important to medieval audiences, establishing Ragnar's place in an unbroken chain of heroes stretching back to the mythological age. Second, the tale of her hidden identity and subsequent revelation is a classic folk motif, the disguised princess who must prove her true worth. By incorporating this element, the saga makers were tapping into narrative patterns that their audience would find deeply satisfying, creating a sense that Ragnar's story followed the same archetypal patterns as the greatest tales of their tradition. Third, Aslaug's intelligence and prophetic abilities make her an active participant in the legend rather than a passive prize to be won. She solves riddles, makes prophecies, advises Ragnar, and raises sons who will become legendary in their own right. She's a fitting mother for the warriors who will avenge Ragnar's death and conquer much of England, a woman whose combination of intelligence, beauty, and prophetic insight marks her as extraordinary, even in a saga tradition that featured many remarkable women. The fact that Ragnar disregarded her warning about Ivar's conception is also significant. It shows a characteristic flaw in the heroic character: impatience, excessive desire, the inability to subordinate immediate wants to long-term wisdom. This flaw doesn't diminish Ragnar in the eyes of the saga audience. Rather, it makes him more human, more real, more understandable. Perfect heroes are less interesting than flawed ones, and the saga tradition understood this instinctively. The consequences of that impulsive decision, Ivar's disability, and the way it would shape his character and his approach to leadership, would ripple throughout the rest of the legend, affecting not just Ivar himself, but the entire course of events. In a sense, Ragnar's moment of weakness in disregarding Aslaug's prophecy would create one of the most formidable and cunning leaders of the Viking Age, a man whose physical limitations would force him to develop capabilities that might otherwise have remained dormant. In the quiet halls of Ragnar's kingdom, between expeditions and adventures, you can imagine Aslaug managing the complex household of a great king, raising sons who would be kings themselves, preserving the stories and traditions of her own heroic heritage, preparing the next generation to continue the legacy of conquest and glory. She represents a different kind of strength than Lagertha's martial prowess or Thora's beauty, but strength nonetheless. The endurance to maintain order while her husband goes adventuring, the wisdom to raise extraordinary children, the patience to build slowly rather than seeking immediate glory. And she carries within her the memory of her parents' tragic love, perhaps understanding better than anyone else the costs of the heroic life, the way that glory and fame are often purchased at the price of happiness and peace. She has seen through her parents' story how love can be destroyed by ambition and magic, and the machinations of others. Perhaps this understanding shapes how she raises her own sons, tempering their ambition with wisdom, or perhaps she simply accepts that the heroic life will always involve suffering alongside triumph, that you cannot have the glory without also accepting the pain. Chapter 5. The Sons Who Made the Father. Paradoxically, the most historically real thing we have about Ragnar Lothbrok is not Ragnar himself, but his sons. Modern research tells us that some of the men named in the sagas as Ragnar's sons actually lived, that they were real historical figures whose deeds are recorded in contemporary chronicles written by people who witnessed or heard about their activities. These sons provide the anchor points that might, or might not, connect the legendary father to actual history. For example, historians know that a Viking leader named Bjorn Ironside was raiding cities along the Seine River and even venturing into the Mediterranean between 857 and 862. Frankish chronicles mention him specifically, describing his audacious raids deep into territory that had rarely or never seen Viking ships. These raids took him far from the familiar waters of northern Europe, down through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea, attacking cities along the coasts of Spain, southern France, and Italy. The scale and ambition of these expeditions was remarkable. Björn and his fellow raiders, the sources mention another leader named Hastin who shared command, sailed for years, covering thousands of miles, attacking targets that had thought themselves safe from northern threats. They captured and plundered Luna in Italy, a wealthy city on the coast. According to later legend, they actually thought Luna was Rome, and were disappointed when they realized their mistake, though this story might be apocryphal, created to either mock the Vikings' supposed ignorance or to amplify the audacity of their ambitions. They returned to Francia in 862, with ships loaded with treasure and slaves, having demonstrated that Viking reach extended far beyond the northern waters they called home, that nowhere in Christian Europe was truly safe from their depredations. The psychological impact of these Mediterranean raids was profound, shattering the assumption that distance provided security, forcing even regions far from Scandinavia to consider how they would defend against this new threat. You also know that warriors named Ivar and Ubba were among the leaders of the great heathen army that invaded England in 865, a massive Viking force that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of Britain. Historical sources from the period, primarily the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but also various Frankish annals and Irish records, mention these leaders explicitly, describing their campaigns across England, their victories over Anglo-Saxon kings, their establishment of Viking control over large portions of the island. Irish annals suggest that Ivar died in Dublin in 873, describing him as King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, a title that indicates he had achieved a position of considerable power and influence, ruling over an Irish sea empire that connected Viking settlements in Ireland with Viking-controlled territories in northern England. The annals describe his death matter-of-factly, without the dramatic details that the Sagas would later add, simply recording that a powerful Viking leader had died, and that his death represented a significant political event. Ubba died in battle near Devon in 878, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, fighting against the forces of Wessex. The Chronicle describes a battle where a Viking force was defeated and Ubba was killed, though it doesn't provide extensive details about the fighting or about Ubba's role beyond noting that he was one of the leaders and that his death was significant. Halfdan is mentioned in historical sources as another leader of the great heathen army. He seems to have taken control of Northumbria after its conquest, establishing himself as ruler there and beginning the process of settling Viking warriors on English lands, transforming raiders into farmers and landowners, creating the conditions for permanent Scandinavian settlement in northern England. The exploits of these famous Viking leaders are scattered throughout the 9th century records kept by monks and chroniclers across England, Francia, and Ireland. They appear in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in Frankish annals, like the Annals of Saint Bertin, in Irish records, like the Annals of Ulster. These contemporary sources, written by people who were alive during or shortly after the events they describe, provide evidence that historians can work with, facts that can be checked and cross-referenced. You know for certain that these men were real historical figures, men whose decisions and actions had tangible consequences that changed the course of history, who killed kings and conquered kingdoms, whose descendants would rule territories for generations. Their historical reality is not in doubt in the way that Ragnar's is. But here's the fundamental problem that historians must grapple with, the question that lies at the heart of the Ragnar mystery. When you compare the sagas to the actual historical records from the 9th century, something crucial doesn't line up. In the sagas written centuries later, these Viking leaders who terrorized medieval Europe are all Ragnar's sons, united by blood and family loyalty, brothers who inherited their father's ambition and martial prowess. The sagas create a neat family structure, a single dynasty producing multiple great warriors, all working together to avenge their father's death and to establish their own kingdom. But the contemporary 9th century Anglo-Saxon and Frankish records, the sources written by people who were actually there or who talked to people who were there, don't say a single word about who their father was. There's a deafening silence where you would expect to find such an important detail. The chroniclers mention Ivar, Ubba, Halfdan, Björn. They describe these men's actions in considerable detail, sometimes with considerable horror and hostility, given that they were writing about enemies who were destroying their world. But they never mention Ragnar as their father. What's more, there's no record in these contemporary sources confirming that Björn, Ivar, Halfdan, Ubba, and Sigurd were even brothers. When these men appear in the historical record, they're described as independent war leaders, sometimes cooperating, but sometimes acting entirely on their own, sometimes working together, but with no indication that they're related by blood. They appear to be a confederation of powerful warriors, perhaps allied through mutual interest or shared goals, but not necessarily a family unit. So, how did this connection between them get made over the years? How did they transform from independent leaders into sons of a legendary father? How did the saga tradition create this family structure that doesn't appear in the contemporary sources? Let's follow the breadcrumbs left in the historical records, tracing how the figure of Ragnar emerges gradually from the mists of time, how he evolves from a possible historical figure into a legendary character, into the father figure who unites all the great Vikings of the 9th century under a single family banner. The first historical text to mention Ragnar appears around 1070, more than 2 centuries after he supposedly lived and died. A Norman historian named William of Jumièges, writing a history of the Dukes of Normandy, mentions that the famous Viking king Bjorn Ironside's father was a man named Lothbrok. That's it. That's the entire reference, just a name, Lothbrok, identified as Bjorn's father. Nothing more about Ragnar, no details about his life or deeds, no description of his conquests or his death, just the bare mention of a name, Lothbrok. A few years later, around 1075, the name pops up again in a different context. The German chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing a history of the archbishops of Hamburg-Bremen and including extensive information about Scandinavia and the conversion of the northern peoples to Christianity, mentions that Lothbrok was the father of the cruel King Ivar, who invaded England and who was known for his terrible persecution of Christians. Again, just a fragmentary reference, a genealogical note without elaboration, a way of identifying Ivar by reference to his father without providing any information about who that father was or what he did. Then around the 1030s, an Icelandic priest and historian named Ari Orgulsson, sometimes called Ari the Learned because of his reputation for historical knowledge, becomes the first person to put the names together explicitly. Ragnar Lothbrok. In his Íslendingabók, a brief history of Iceland and its settlement, Ari mentions Ragnar Lothbrok as a historical figure, though he doesn't provide extensive details about him. But this is the first time we have the full name that would become legendary, the combination of the personal name Ragnar with the nickname or family name Lothbrok. By the 12th century, more than 300 years after the supposed historical Ragnar would have lived, the stories about him have become full-blown legends, passed from person to person, embellished in the retelling, merged with other stories and mythological motifs, acquiring the kind of narrative complexity and dramatic structure that marks fully developed literary tradition. The greatest warriors of the 9th century are now officially identified as his sons in these later narratives, all gathered under his paternal banner. And at this precise moment in the historical record, Ragnar transforms from a possible historical figure into a legendary character, from a man who might have existed into a hero who certainly inspired. This transformation happens gradually over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, as oral traditions are shaped and reshaped by storytellers, as different accounts are merged or reconciled, as the political needs of contemporary rulers influence how the past is remembered and depicted. By the time the major sagas are written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, Ragnar has become a fully realized literary character, with a complete narrative arc from birth to death, with complex relationships and psychological depth, with a story that follows the patterns of heroic literature, while also incorporating historical details and geographical specificity. Still, even as the saga tradition was developing, historians and chronicle writers kept searching for traces of a real Ragnar, examining the fragmentary evidence with whatever tools of scholarship were available to them. They identified several candidates, men who appear in 9th century sources and who might be connected to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. The most widely accepted candidate among modern historians is a Danish Viking leader named Reginherus, who besieged Paris in 845 in one of the most dramatic events of the entire 9th century. The siege of Paris by Reginherus is well documented in Frankish sources, particularly in the Annals of Saint Bertin, a contemporary chronicle that provides detailed information about events in the Frankish kingdoms during this period. According to the Frankish sources, Reginherus sailed up the Seine with a fleet of 120 ships carrying approximately 4,000 men. An enormous force for the period, probably the largest Viking army that had yet appeared in Francia. As his fleet moved up the river toward Paris, he attacked settlements along the way, plundering monasteries and towns, taking captives who could be sold as slaves or ransomed back to their families, demonstrating the overwhelming military power at his disposal. Paris in 845 was not yet the great fortified city it would later become. It was centered on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the Seine, and it had some fortifications, but nothing capable of withstanding a determined assault by a force as large as Reginherus commanded. The Frankish king at the time was Charles the Bold, grandson of Charlemagne, but Charles was facing multiple challenges to his authority and couldn't immediately assemble a force large enough to meet the Vikings in open battle. Reginherus besieged the city, and the Frankish sources describe the terror this inspired among the population. The Vikings had a reputation for brutality, for showing no mercy to those who resisted them, and the people of Paris feared the worst. During the siege, Reginherus committed an act that the Frankish chroniclers recorded with particular horror. He captured 111 Frankish soldiers and had them executed on an island in the Seine, within sight of Paris, apparently as a demonstration of power, and perhaps as a sacrifice to the Norse gods. The public mass execution of captives was shocking even by the violent standards of the 9th century. It demonstrated that Reginherus was willing to commit acts that violated the usual customs of warfare, that he didn't respect the conventions that usually governed how Christian warriors treated prisoners and non-combatants. The psychological impact of this demonstration was immense, spreading terror not just in Paris, but throughout Francia as the news spread. Eventually, unable to defeat the Vikings militarily, Charles the Bold negotiated a payment to convince Reginherus to leave. The Frankish sources record the amount as 7,000 pounds of silver, an enormous sum representing a significant portion of the royal treasury. This payment of danegeld, Danish money, though the term would be more commonly used later in England, set a precedent that would be repeated many times over the coming decades. It demonstrated that Viking raids could be enormously profitable, even without permanent conquest, that simply threatening violence could generate wealth, that the Frankish kingdoms were willing to pay to avoid the destruction that Viking armies could inflict. Reginherus took the silver and sailed away, his ships heavy with plunder, leaving Paris and the Seine Valley devastated but intact. The Frankish chroniclers record that he died soon after, returning to Denmark, perhaps from disease contracted during the campaign, or perhaps from some other cause. Medieval sources often attributed sudden deaths to divine punishment when they happened to enemies, so Reginherus's death might have been presented as God's vengeance for his attacks on Christian lands and people. Could this Reginherus be the historical basis for Ragnar Lothbrok? The name is similar enough that linguistic evolution over time could connect them. Latin-writing Frankish chroniclers might have rendered a Norse name like Ragnar as Reginherus, adapting it to Latin conventions. The dating is approximately right. 845 is early enough in the Viking Age that a leader active then could plausibly be the father of men who led the great heathen army in 865. The scale of his operations matches what you would expect from a legendary Viking king. This wasn't a small raid, but a major expedition that struck at one of the most important cities in Western Europe. But there's no definitive proof, just tantalizing possibilities. The Frankish sources don't call him Ragnar or Lothbrok, only Reginherus. They don't mention his sons or provide any information about his family. They don't describe his death in a snake pit or any of the other dramatic details from the saga tradition. He's just a Viking leader who conducted a major raid, extracted an enormous payment, and then disappears from the historical record. Another possible candidate appears in the 12th century, Annals of St. Neots, an English chronicle that incorporates some earlier material. The Annals tell a story about events in 878, when the English defeated a Viking army and captured a banner called the Raven. According to the Annals, this banner was remarkably crafted, and it had been woven by the daughters of a man named Lothbrok. This is the only detail provided, just that the banner's makers were Lothbrok's daughters, with no additional information about who Lothbrok was or what he had done. Again, the name is strikingly similar to Lothbrok, and the connection to famous Viking activities in England is clear. But again, there's no way to be certain this Lothbrok and the legendary Ragnar are the same person. The reference could be to someone else entirely, someone whose name happened to be similar. Or it could preserve a genuine memory of Ragnar, transmitted through multiple generations, remembered primarily through this one detail about a banner his daughters made. A third candidate is a Viking leader named Ragnar, mentioned in the Gesta Danorum, the Danish history written by Saxo Grammaticus, that also preserves the story of Lagertha. Saxo mentions various Vikings named Ragnar at different points in his narrative, and some historians suggest that one of these might be the same person as Ragnar, who attacked Paris, just viewed through a different source tradition. The Frankish records state that Ragnar died shortly after leaving Paris, but Saxo's history records a Ragnar leading expeditions to Ireland and elsewhere in the 850s. If they are the same person, then the Frankish report of his early death was wrong, or perhaps deliberately fabricated. Maybe Charles the Bald wanted people to think his enemy had died as divine punishment, even if that wasn't actually true. But untangling these various references, trying to determine whether they refer to one person or several different people, is extraordinarily difficult. The sources are fragmentary, often contradictory, written by people with different agendas and different levels of access to accurate information. Names were common and could be shared by multiple people. The historical record from the 9th century is simply not complete enough to allow definitive conclusions. Despite all these intriguing candidates, historians have developed a theory that is probably more accurate than trying to identify a single historical Ragnar. What if Ragnar Lothbrok wasn't a single person at all? What if the legendary Ragnar is actually a composite character, a legendary figure inspired by several famous Viking leaders who lived around the 9th century? Maybe Ragnar from the Irish sources, and Lothbrok from the English sources are all part of the recipe that created the legend, along with elements borrowed from other heroes and from mythological patterns. This theory makes considerable sense when you think about how legends develop over time through oral tradition. Oral tradition naturally tends to simplify and consolidate complex historical realities. Instead of keeping track of multiple similar characters, several successful Viking leaders who raided England and Francia during the 9th century, the tradition might naturally create a single memorable figure who embodied the achievements and characteristics of an entire generation of Viking warriors. Different stories about different men might have been gradually merged, creating a superhero who combined the best deeds from various sources. The siege of Paris attributed to Ragnar, expeditions to the Mediterranean, perhaps led by Björn Ironside, raids in England and Ireland by various leaders. All of these might have been gathered together and attributed to a single figure, Ragnar Lothbrok, whose very name came to represent the peak of Viking achievement during the first generations of the Viking Age. Later generations, wanting to make sense of the heroic age their ancestors lived through, might naturally have created a father figure who could contain and explain all the various heroes they had heard stories about. If all these famous warriors of the 9th century were brothers, if they were all sons of a single legendary father, then the complex, chaotic history of Viking expansion becomes a comprehensible family saga, a story with clear protagonists and motivations, a narrative arc that audiences can follow and understand. This process of creating composite heroes and organizing history into family sagas was not unique to Scandinavian tradition. Many cultures have done similar things, creating legendary ancestors who unite different historical figures and events under a single narrative umbrella. The important question isn't just whether Ragnar existed as a single historical person, but why later generations needed him to exist, what function the legend served in their culture and politics. And that brings us to perhaps the most crucial question about Ragnar Lothbrok. Why did the sagas create such a hero? Why was he needed? What purpose did he serve? Chapter 6. The Making of a Dynastic Legend. Throughout history, across many cultures and time periods, you see rulers tracing their lineage back to legendary figures, even to mythological beings, as a way to legitimize their power and authority. This is not cynical manipulation, or not merely that, but reflects a genuinely held belief that greatness runs in families, that leadership ability and heroic qualities are inherited through blood, that knowing someone's ancestry tells you something important about who they are and what they're capable of. The kings of Sparta, for instance, claimed descent from the Greek hero Heracles, borrowing his divine strength and heroic legacy for their own political purposes. Having Heracles as an ancestor meant that the Spartans' dual monarchy was divinely ordained, that their kings inherited not just political power but heroic virtue from their legendary ancestor. He connected Sparta's present to the Age of Heroes, suggesting that Spartan warriors were the descendants of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology, and therefore naturally superior to their enemies. The founder of Rome, Romulus, was said to be the son of Mars, the war god, giving the eternal city a foundation myth that connected its destiny to the will of the gods themselves. Being founded by the son of a god meant that Rome's imperial ambitions were sanctioned by divine authority, that Rome's military success was foreordained by the gods, that Roman domination of the Mediterranean world was simply the fulfillment of divine plan, rather than mere human ambition and military power. History is full of these manufactured family trees, many of them deliberately created by dynasties wanting to build their power on a solid foundation of legendary prestige. Practice was so common in the ancient and medieval worlds that it was almost expected. A king without a heroic or divine ancestor was somehow lacking in legitimacy, suspect, missing a crucial element of kingship. The Anglo-Saxon kings of England traced their ancestry back to Woden, the Germanic equivalent of Odin, claiming divine descent for their royal houses. Carolingian dynasty that ruled Francia emphasized its connections to earlier Frankish kings and, through various genealogical claims, to Roman emperors and biblical figures. The Byzantine emperors maintained elaborate genealogies connecting them to Augustus, and through him to the Trojan hero, Aeneas, and ultimately to the goddess Venus. These genealogical claims served multiple important functions. They legitimized current rulers by connecting them to the past, suggesting that their rule was not a break with tradition, but a continuation of an ancient and honorable lineage. They provided a sense of stability and continuity in politically unstable times, offering reassurance that despite changes in individual rulers, the essential nature of kingship remained constant, rooted in ancient tradition. And they created a kind of competition among ruling families. If your rival could claim descent from heroes or gods, you needed to make similar or better claims or risk appearing inferior. Today, historians believe that starting in the 10th century, some Viking kings took a similar path to consolidate and legitimize their power. They needed connections to the heroic past, to the first generations of the Viking Age, when Scandinavian warriors first conquered territories in England and established kingdoms that would endure for generations. They needed to explain and justify their right to rule over lands that their ancestors had conquered, but that might seem to have no natural connection to Scandinavian rulers. Two names stand out in this context as particularly important. Guthrum, who invaded England between 880 and 890 and eventually established the Danelaw, ruling over a large portion of eastern and northern England. Guthrum was one of the Viking leaders who fought against King Alfred of Wessex in the 870s and 880s. After years of warfare, Guthrum and Alfred eventually made peace, with Guthrum accepting baptism as part of the treaty terms and agreeing to rule his portion of England in cooperation with Alfred, rather than in opposition. Guthrum took the Christian name Ethelstan at his baptism, with Alfred serving as his godfather, creating a spiritual kinship between the two rulers that helped maintain the peace between their kingdoms. Guthrum's kingdom, which would become known as the Danelaw, because it was the area where Danish law and custom prevailed rather than Anglo-Saxon law, endured for generations. His descendants and successors ruled over this territory, creating a Scandinavian presence in England that would persist until the Norman conquest and beyond. But these rulers needed to legitimize their rule, to explain why they had the right to rule over English lands, to connect themselves to earlier Viking conquerors who had first established Scandinavian power in England. The great situation was even more complex. He was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, who had briefly conquered England in 1013, and the grandson of Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. But Kinnart's path to power was not straightforward. After his father's death, the English temporarily restored their Anglo-Saxon king, and Kinnart had to reconquer England through a brutal campaign in 1015-1016. Once he had secured England, he also inherited Denmark from his brother, and later conquered Norway, creating an empire that stretched across the North Sea, and that represented a level of Scandinavian power that had never before been achieved. But ruling this empire, holding it together, required more than just military power. Kinnart needed legitimacy. He needed to convince the English that his rule was not just military occupation, but rightful kingship. He needed to convince the Scandinavians that his authority over multiple kingdoms was natural and proper. And one way to do this was through genealogy, by demonstrating that he came from a lineage of great conquerors, that his rule was the continuation of a dynasty that had been established generations earlier by legendary figures. Both Guthrum and Kinnart, according to later genealogies preserved in various sources, trace their ancestry back to Ragnar Lothbrok. Notice the pattern here. Any king who wanted to invade or hold on to England claimed descent from Ragnar, arguing that they had a hereditary right to the lands conquered by his sons. The logic was elegantly simple and politically powerful. If Ragnar's sons had conquered these territories in the 9th century, then their descendants had a legitimate claim to rule them in the 10th and 11th centuries. This pattern extends beyond just these two rulers. Various Scandinavian kings and jarls claimed Ragnar as an ancestor, creating a web of genealogical connections that made Ragnar the common ancestor of multiple ruling houses. He became, in the genealogical tradition, the trunk from which many branches of Scandinavian royalty grew, the fountainhead of dynasties that would rule over territories from Dublin to Novgorod. So let's read the whole story backward for a moment, approaching it from the end rather than the beginning, seeing how the political needs of later generations might have shaped the legend. It might make more sense this way, might help explain why the legend took the form it did. You're looking at the situation from the end of the Viking Age, in the 10th and 11th centuries. The kings invading or ruling England during this period need to legitimize their rule. They can't rely on military power alone. Military power can be challenged by other military power, and even the most successful conqueror needs some claim to rightful authority beyond simple force. They need to connect themselves to the Viking kings who ruled there before, to establish that their conquest isn't mere opportunistic aggression, but the reclaiming of an ancient right, the restoration of a dynasty that had been temporarily interrupted, but whose claim to England was never fully extinguished. The most suitable candidates for creating this legitimizing lineage are the Viking leaders who invaded England in 865 with the Great Heathen Army, the force that fundamentally changed the political landscape of Britain. These were undeniably successful conquerors, men whose achievements were remembered and celebrated, who had defeated Anglo-Saxon kings and established Scandinavian control over large portions of England. Their conquest was the foundational event of Viking England, the moment when Vikings stopped being just raiders and became rulers. But how to connect the current generation of kings to those legendary warriors? From more than a century earlier, the historical record didn't provide clear genealogies. The contemporary 9th century sources didn't record who these Viking leaders' fathers were, or whether they were related to each other. There were names preserved: Ivar, Ubba, Halfdan, Bjorn, but their relationships to each other and to current rulers were unclear. Then an idea emerges, perhaps gradually through multiple storytellers and saga makers working over generations, perhaps through the deliberate efforts of royal genealogists trying to create a pedigree for their patrons. Why not create a legendary Viking lineage by making all these historical conquerors brothers? It solves multiple problems at once. It simplifies a complex historical period into a single family saga that audiences can easily follow and remember. It creates a clear line of descent for later kings to claim. If you could establish that you were descended from one of Ragnar's sons, you inherited all the legitimacy that came from their legendary conquests. It transforms a chaotic period of raiding and conquest into an orderly narrative of family achievement and dynastic succession. From there, it's just a matter of craft and imagination for court historians and saga writers, working over generations to flesh out the detail. The famous Viking leaders who invaded England are gathered under one family banner, all united as sons of a single father. All the great kings of the Viking Age are woven into his bloodline, making anyone who could claim descent from him heir to a legacy of conquest and glory. And this father, this figure who contained the entire heroic age within his lineage, needed a name, needed a story, needed to be developed as a character who could bear the weight of all this genealogical and political significance. That character became Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking king, whose very name came to embody the entire first phase of the Viking Age, whose story incorporated elements from multiple sources and traditions, who served as the anchor point for an entire web of genealogical claims and dynastic ambitions. The process probably wasn't entirely cynical or calculated. Medieval people genuinely believed in the importance of lineage, in the idea that greatness ran in families, that leadership ability and martial prowess were inherited through blood. If several great warriors had emerged at the same time in the 9th century, it made intuitive sense that they might be brothers, that their shared greatness might stem from their shared blood, from having the same father who had passed on his heroic qualities to all his sons. The saga makers weren't necessarily fabricating a lie so much as trying to make sense of history, to find the pattern that explained why the mid-9th century had been such an extraordinary period of Viking achievement. In a culture that thought in terms of kinship and lineage, explaining multiple great warriors as brothers made more sense than seeing them as unrelated individuals who just happened to achieve greatness at the same time. Over time, over generations of retelling and elaboration, the bare skeleton of genealogy acquired flesh and blood. Stories accumulated around Ragnar's name like barnacles on a ship's hull. He acquired wives, each with her own compelling tale. Thora, who he won by slaying a serpent, Lagertha the shieldmaiden who fought in battles, Aslaug the daughter of legendary heroes. He gained a backstory that connected him to earlier legendary kings, creating an unbroken chain reaching back to the mythological origins of the Scandinavian peoples. His death became a dramatic martyrdom in a pit of serpents, a scene that explained the righteous fury of his sons and justified their terrible revenge on the English king who had killed him. Each generation of saga tellers added something new, adapted the story to their own times and concerns, emphasized different elements depending on what their particular audience wanted to hear. The Ragnar, who appears in sources from the 11th century, is less developed than the Ragnar of 12th century chronicles, and both are less fully realized than the Ragnar who emerges in the 13th century sagas written in Iceland. By the 13th century, when the major sagas were being written down, Ragnar have become a fully realized literary character with psychology, motivation, complex relationships, and a complete narrative arc from birth to death. He had become, in literary terms, as real as any character in medieval literature, with a depth and complexity that rivaled the heroes of classical epics or Arthurian romance. But we should be careful not to dismiss the legend entirely, just because it was constructed over time by later generations for political purposes. The very fact that Viking kings felt the need to claim descent from Ragnar tells us something important about his cultural significance, about how he functioned in Scandinavian political imagination. Whether or not a single historical person named Ragnar Lothbrok conquered England and died in a snake pit, the name clearly represented something powerful in the Viking worldview, a connection to the heroic age, a symbol of Viking achievement at its peak, perhaps an ideal of what a king should be. The legend served real functions in medieval Scandinavian society. It provided kings with legitimacy, connecting them to a heroic past and justifying their rule. It gave people a sense of cultural identity, a shared story that defined what it meant to be Scandinavian, that celebrated the achievements of their ancestors. It offered a template for kingship, showing through Ragnar's story both the heights that a great king could reach and the costs of the heroic life. And the legend continues to serve functions today, though in different ways for different purposes. Modern retellings of Ragnar's story in novels, films, and television series tap into something that still resonates: the appeal of the outsider who challenges established order, the self-made hero who rises through courage and cunning, the tragic figure whose pride leads to his downfall, but whose death inspires greater achievements by the next generation. Whether Ragnar Lothbrok was real or not, he has had real influence, real impact, a real kind of existence in human culture and imagination. Epilog, between history and legend. So, you've followed the tale of Ragnar Lothbrok from beginning to end now, from the grey waters of the North Sea, where dragon-prowed ships first appeared on the horizon, to the snake pit in Northumbria, where the legendary king supposedly met his end, from his marriages to extraordinary women to his son's conquest of England. You've seen how the legend was constructed piece by piece over centuries, how it served the purposes of later generations, how it might connect to historical reality, or might be entirely a creation of saga writers and genealogists working hundreds of years after the supposed events. The question that began this journey remains, perhaps inevitably, without a definitive answer. Was Ragnar Lothbrok real? Did he actually exist as a historical person, or is he purely a legendary construction? A composite character created by combining multiple historical figures with mythological elements and political necessity? The honest answer, as historians must acknowledge when they're being rigorous and careful about the limits of what can be known, is that we simply cannot determine this with certainty based on the available evidence. The historical record from the 9th century is too fragmentary, too contradictory, too shaped by the biases and limitations of its authors to allow for definitive conclusions. The sagas written in the 13th and 14th centuries preserve traditions that might contain genuine historical memory, but those traditions have been filtered through centuries of oral transmission and shaped by the literary and political concerns of the saga authors. The available evidence allows for multiple interpretations, and honest scholars can disagree about which interpretation is most likely. Perhaps there was a Viking leader in the mid-9th century named something like Ragnar Lothbrok, who achieved enough fame through his raids and conquests that later generations built legends around his name, attributing to him the deeds of multiple people and embellishing his story with mythological elements and dramatic scene. In this interpretation, there's a historical core to the legend, a real person whose actual achievements provided the foundation on which the legend was built. Perhaps Ragnar is a composite figure, combining elements from several different historical Vikings. Regin-Herres, who besieged Paris in 845. Ragnar, who appears in Irish annals writing in Ireland. Lothbrok, whose daughter supposedly wove the Raven banner, and possibly others whose names and deeds were merged over time as oral tradition. In this interpretation, asking whether Ragnar was real is like asking whether the average person is real. He represents a type, an amalgamation, rather than a single individual. Or perhaps Ragnar Lothbrok never existed at all as a historical person, and the entire legend was created by later Viking kings and their court historians who needed a legendary ancestor to legitimize their rule over England and other conquered territories. In this interpretation, the saga writers and genealogists of the 10th through 13th centuries invented or radically embellished what we can say with confidence. What the evidence does support clearly is this. Historians are more skeptical of the specific story attributed to Ragnar than of his actual existence. The saga narrative, with all its dramatic detail, the serpent slaying to win Thora, the marriage to the shieldmaiden Lagertha, the disguised princess Aslaug solving riddles, the death in a snake pit while composing poetry, the tidy family structure of his sons who all just happened to be the most famous Vikings of their generation. This narrative contains more legend than history. The story as the sagas tell it is too neat, too dramatically satisfying, too perfectly structured to be simple historical reportage. It follows the patterns of heroic literature too closely. The hero who proves himself by slaying monsters, who wins extraordinary wives through cleverness and courage, who produces sons who surpass him, who meets a dramatic end that inspires revenge and further heroic deed. These are the building blocks of legend, the narrative elements that appear in hero tales across many cultures, suggesting that the Ragnar story has been shaped by literary conventions and storytelling traditions as much as, or more, than by historical memory. But the possibility that somewhere behind all this legend there was a real person remains open, neither proven nor disproven by the available evidence. There might have been a successful Viking leader in the 9th century whose fame was such that later generations wanted to claim connection to him, whose name became attached to various exploits, whether he performed them personally or not, who served as a kind of template or ideal for what a Viking king should be: brave in battle, clever in strategy, successful in conquest, capable of inspiring loyalty in his followers and fear in his enemies. He might have been less grand than the saga version, less romantically involved with extraordinary women, less dramatically killed, but nonetheless real and influential enough that his name survived to become legendary. Perhaps he really did lead raids on England and Francia. Perhaps he really did have sons who became famous warriors. Perhaps some kernel of his actual story is preserved in the sagas, buried beneath layers of embellishment and mythological elaboration. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the name Ragnar Lothbrok never belonged to any single historical person, but was created as a convenient label for a type, for the archetypal Viking conqueror of the first generation of the Viking Age, and all the stories that attached to that name were really stories about different people. The uncertainty is frustrating if what you want is definitive answers, clear facts, historical certainty. But perhaps the uncertainty is itself meaningful. Perhaps it tells us something important about how history works, about the relationship between what actually happened and how we remember and retell what happened. And perhaps, in the end, It doesn't matter as much as we might initially think whether Ragnar Lothbrok was historically real in the sense of being a single identifiable person who lived in the 9th century and did specific things that can be documented through contemporary sources. Legends have their own kind of reality, their own power and influence in the world, regardless of their historical accuracy. The Ragnar of the Sagas inspired real people, shaped real events, influenced real decisions by real kings who claimed descent from him. The Ragnar of legend helped define what it meant to be a Viking, helped create the cultural identity that Scandinavians carried with them as they explored, raided, traded, and settled across the medieval world from America to Asia. The Ragnar story provided a framework for understanding Viking history, a narrative that made sense of a chaotic and violent period, a hero whose achievements and failures reflected the larger patterns of Viking expansion and eventual assimilation into European Christian culture. Think about how many people over the centuries have been inspired by the tale of Ragnar Lothbrok. Not just medieval kings claiming his lineage, but poets finding material for their verses, storytellers entertaining their audiences with his adventures, historians trying to separate fact from fiction in his legend, and in our own time, novelists, filmmakers, and television producers continuing to retell and adapt his story for new generations. Whether he was real or not, Ragnar has had real influence, real impact, a real kind of existence in human culture and imagination. He has shaped how we think about the Viking Age, has influenced our understanding of medieval Scandinavian culture, has provided a lens through which we view the complex process of cultural contact and conflict between pagan Scandinavians and Christian Europeans during the early Middle Ages. The Viking Age that Ragnar supposedly inaugurated or participated in, depending on which version of the chronology you follow, lasted from 793 with the Lindisfarne raid until 1066, when Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge marked its conventional end. Those 3 centuries transformed Europe in ways that are still visible today. The Vikings established kingdoms in England, Ireland, northern France, Sicily, and along the rivers of Russia. They explored the North Atlantic, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They created trade networks that stretched from Baghdad to Dublin, from Byzantium to the Arctic, carrying silver, furs, slaves, and cultural influences across vast distances. The genetic and cultural legacy of the Vikings remains visible today across northern Europe and beyond. DNA studies show Scandinavian genetic markers in populations throughout the British Isles, in Normandy, in Iceland, in parts of Eastern Europe. The English language contains hundreds of words borrowed from Old Norse. Everyday words like sky, egg, knife, husband, and window, suggesting the deep integration of Viking settlers into English society. The legal systems of several nations show Viking influence, particularly in concepts related to property rights and local governance. The very names of places preserve Viking memory. Any place name ending in by or thorp or toft in England indicates Viking settlement. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was itself, in a sense, a delayed Viking conquest, achieved by the descendants of Vikings who had settled in Normandy barely a century and a half earlier. William the Conqueror's great-great-great-grandfather was Rollo, the Viking leader who had established the Duchy of Normandy through a combination of military pressure and negotiated settlement. So the Anglo-Saxon England that had been fighting off Viking invasions for more than 2 centuries ultimately fell to men who were culturally French, but whose ancestry was Scandinavian. And throughout all this history, wherever Vikings settled or ruled or traded, the story of Ragnar Lothbrok was told and retold, adapted and embellished, serving as a connection to the heroic past, a legitimization of present power, an inspiration for future glory. His legend grew alongside the influence of the people who told it, his fame spreading as far as Viking ships could sail and beyond, carried by traders and travelers and missionaries into lands the historical Ragnar, if he existed, never saw. In the end, Ragnar Lothbrok exists in that liminal space between history and legend, between fact and fiction, between what happened and what people needed to believe had happened. He's a figure woven from threads of historical possibility, mythological tradition, political necessity, and literary imagination. Whether the man existed or not, the legend certainly does, and its persistence across more than 1,000 years, its ability to be continually rediscovered and reinterpreted by new generations, testifies to something important about human nature and our need for heroes. We need stories that make sense of history, that find patterns in chaos, that show us that individual actions matter, that courage and cleverness can triumph over seemingly impossible odds. We need heroes who are flawed enough to be relatable, but great enough to be inspirational. We need tales that connect us to the past, that give us a sense of where we come from, that provide us with cultural identity and shared narrative. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he was one man or many or none, provides all of this. His story, in all its various versions and adaptations, speaks to something fundamental about the human experience, about ambition and achievement, about family and legacy, about the costs of glory and the price of pride, about aging and being surpassed by the next generation, about facing death with courage and dignity. As you drift towards sleep now, let the image of those dragon-prowed ships fade gently into the mist. Let the grey waters of the North Sea merge with the darkness behind your eyelids. Let Ragnar Lothbrok, whatever he was, man or myth or some mixture of both, fade back into the legendary past where he has lived for more than 1,000 years, neither fully gone nor ever truly present, existing in that eternal realm where stories never quite die and heroes never quite disappear. The Viking Age has long since ended. The last longship has returned from its final voyage. The old gods have given way to Christianity, and Christianity, in turn, has been challenged by secularity and other faiths. The kingdoms carved out by Vikings have been transformed by centuries of change, their Scandinavian character diluted or erased by intermarriage and cultural assimilation. The world Ragnar supposedly knew, if he knew any world at all, is gone completely, surviving only in archaeological fragments and in the words preserved by saga writers working centuries after the events they described. But the story remains, told and retold across the centuries, adapted and readapted for each new age that discovers it, still capable of inspiring and entertaining, still mysterious enough that scholars debate its truth, still vivid enough that audiences can imagine themselves into that distant world of cold seas and bold deeds. And so Ragnar Lothbrok, king or commoner, hero or invention, one man or many or none, sails on through the centuries, eternal and impossible, legendary, and perhaps real, forever approaching but never quite reaching the shores of certainty. Just past the next headland, the truth about him. But perhaps the truth is less important than the story itself, less valuable than what the story tells us about the people who created it and the people who continue to retell it. Perhaps Ragnar's greatest achievement, if we can call it that, is not any historical conquest or battle, but his conquest of imagination and memory, his ability to persist as a compelling character long after any historical person who might have inspired him has crumbled to dust. Sleep now, and let the legends wash over you like waves on a northern shore, rhythmic and endless, carrying you gently into dreams where history and myth merge into one, where heroes walk the earth, and impossible deeds seem suddenly possible, where the past lives again in imagination. Let yourself drift on those northern waters, neither asleep nor awake, neither in the present nor the past, neither fully believing nor fully doubting, existing for a time in that liminal space where Ragnar himself exists, where legends live, and heroes never truly die. The fields grow quiet now. The smoke has cleared. The god of thunder that once rolled over sky whenever it stormed has faded into silence. Where armies once marched, grass grows tall and green. Where soldiers fell, wildflowers bloom in spring. No longer are the dragon-headed ships feared along Europe's coastlines. Time has done its work, covering the scars, softening the edges, turning battlefields into peaceful meadows. The men who fought, whoever they were, have all gone to their rest. They sleep now beneath the earth they once fought over, and that earth does not distinguish kings from peasants. But they left us something. They left us a legend preserved. They left us lessons about courage and sacrifice, about the price of fame and fortune. They left us the understanding that some things are worth fighting for. The dead have spoken their truths. The continent has been tested and has endured. And now at last there is peace. Sleep well. Dream gently. The story is told. The memory is preserved. And in the morning, when you wake, the world will still be here. Imperfect, beautiful, and ready for the next legend to be forged. Good night, my friends. Good night.